Sometimes the smallest confession says the most. Not a scandal. Not a headline built to shock you. Just a woman, sitting next to her husband of nearly 30 years, admitting something small and human that she's apparently been carrying around for 3 decades. And somehow, that tiny admission ended up saying more about marriage, about love, and about what actually lasts than almost anything else Kelly/Ripa has shared on television. Here's what happened. On a recent episode of Live with Kelly&Mark, the two hosts were talking about Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce's rumored wedding plans, reportedly centered around a Madison Square Garden ceremony that could cost millions of dollars. And in the middle of that conversation, almost like an aside, Kelly/Ripa turned to her husband and admitted the one thing she still regrets about their own wedding day. Not the venue. Not the timing. Not even the fact that they eloped without telling their parents. Flowers. "I'm still sorry we didn't spring for flowers," she said, "because I always think my hands look awkward." Then, with that familiar comic timing she's built an entire career on, she turned toward Mark and added, "Somebody didn't want to spring for flowers." The audience laughed. Mark presumably took the hit in stride the way he always does. And just like that, a throwaway moment about bouquets became something far more interesting to sit with. Because think about what she's actually describing. Kelly/Ripa and Mark Consuelos got married in Las Vegas in 1996, at the Chapel of the Bells, for a total that's been quoted at various points as somewhere between $174 and $179. Depending on which retelling you catch, that number sometimes includes the flight out to Vegas. It's the kind of wedding that costs less than a decent dinner out in Manhattan today. No elaborate seating chart. No months of vendor calls. No guest list negotiations. Just two people who happen to have 2 consecutive days off work at the same time, in the middle of a brutal New York winter, deciding that the desert sounded better than another snowstorm. And what she regrets all these years later isn't the size of it. It isn't the speed of it. It's the flowers. There's something almost startling about how small that regret is, and I think that's exactly why it landed the way it did with viewers. When celebrities talk about their weddings, we're usually bracing for extravagance, for drama, for some kind of larger-than-life story that reminds us how different their world is from ours. Instead, Kelly/Ripa gave viewers the opposite. She gave them a regret so ordinary, so almost embarrassingly small, that it becomes instantly relatable. Anyone who's ever looked back at their own wedding photos and cringed at a random detail, a hairstyle, an outfit choice, an awkward pose, understands exactly what she's talking about. It's not a celebrity confession. It's a human one. And that's really the heart of why this moment resonated the way it did. It wasn't the content of the regret. It was the shape of it. Kelly wasn't performing vulnerability for the cameras. She was doing what couples do after decades together, which is gently, affectionately, needle each other about the past in a way that only works because the foundation underneath it is completely secure. Watch the dynamic closely and you start to notice something else. When Kelly turns to Mark and jokingly blames him for the missing flowers, there's no real edge to it. It's not resentment dressed up as comedy. It's the kind of teasing that only exists inside relationships built on total trust, where you can bring up a decades-old detail as a bit, as a running joke, without either person flinching. That's a specific kind of intimacy. It's not the fireworks and passion version of romance that gets romanticized in movies. It's the version where you know each other so well that even your minor grievances have become inside jokes. And Mark's response tells you just as much. He doesn't get defensive. He doesn't try to rewrite the story. By most accounts, he leans into it, matter-of-factly pointing out that the no-frills approach is exactly what's kept them together this long. "Those marriages stick," he reportedly said, referring to the kind of quick, low-pressure weddings that skip the spectacle entirely. There's a quiet confidence in that response. It's the confidence of a man who isn't threatened by being the punchline of his wife's joke, because he knows the joke isn't really about him. It's about them. It's about a story they've told 100 times and clearly still enjoy telling together. That's worth sitting with for a second because it says something about why audiences have stayed invested in this couple for so long. Kelly/Ripa and Mark Consuelos aren't selling viewers a fantasy of perfect romance. They're offering something almost more compelling. A real marriage aged nearly 30 years that still has room for playful jabs, mild grievances and self-deprecating humor. When Kelly says she still gets stuck on the flowers, she's not undermining the marriage. She's proving how solid it is. You only get to keep telling a joke like that for 30 years if the relationship underneath it never actually wobbled. There's also something quietly moving about the way this story keeps resurfacing. This isn't the first time Kelly has talked about the cost of their wedding on air. Over the years, she's mentioned the number in slightly different ways, sometimes $174, sometimes $179, always somewhere in that same modest range. And each time she brings it up, it's in a different context, comparing it to another celebrity's extravagant plans, using it as advice for younger couples, or just reflecting on how far they've come since that snowy winter in 1996. The number itself barely matters. What matters is that she keeps returning to it, almost like a well-worn photograph she takes out to look at from time to time. It's become part of their shared mythology, the origin story they tell themselves and their audience over and over because it still means something to both of them. And maybe that's the real reason this particular clip caught fire online. It wasn't just funny. It tapped into something viewers have been quietly craving from celebrity culture for a while now. Proof that longevity in relationships doesn't require perfection, doesn't require money, doesn't require the kind of over-the-top gestures that dominate modern wedding culture. Kelly&Ripa is essentially telling millions of viewers that she and her husband got married in under an hour, in a chapel, without their parents' blessing at the time, without a single flower in sight, and it's held for nearly 3 decades. In a moment when even ordinary weddings can cost tens of thousands of dollars, that story lands differently. It almost feels like quiet defiance against the idea that a marriage has to be expensive to be meaningful. It's worth noticing too how naturally this all unfolded. Nobody set out to make a viral moment. There was no pre-planned bit, no scripted confession. It came out of a conversation about someone else's wedding, another couple entirely, and simply spilled over into their own story because that's what happens when two people have been together long enough. Everything reminds them of something. Every headline about a celebrity engagement becomes an excuse to revisit their own history, half nostalgically, half comedically. That kind of unscripted honesty is increasingly rare on television, and it might be exactly why Live with Kelly&Mark continues to draw such a devoted audience. Viewers aren't just tuning in for interviews and games. They're tuning in to watch a real marriage exist in real time, messy jokes and small regrets included. There's a version of this story that could have felt hollow, a quick soundbite designed for a headline, forgotten within a day. But something about the specificity of it, the awkward hands, the missing bouquet, the mock blame aimed at Mark, gave it staying power. It's the kind of detail that feels too small to be manufactured, which is exactly what makes it feel true. Nobody invents a regret about flowers for attention. You only admit something like that if it's actually been sitting with you quietly for 30 years. So what does it all add up to? A wedding that cost less than most people spend on a night out. A marriage that's outlasted countless headline-grabbing celebrity unions built on far bigger budgets and far bigger spectacles. And a single small regret that Kelly&Ripa still can't quite let go of, not because it damaged anything, but because it's become part of the texture of their story. The flowers she never had have somehow turned into one of the most talked about details of a wedding nobody was even supposed to be talking about 30 years later. Maybe that's the real lesson hiding inside this lighthearted moment. It's not about flowers at all. It's about how the smallest details of a life shared with someone become the things you remember, the things you joke about, the things that somehow prove just how far you've come together. Kelly&Ripa and Mark Consuelos didn't need a $3 million venue or a professionally written vow to build something that's lasted this long. They needed 2 days off work, a chapel in the desert, and, apparently, the willingness to laugh about the flowers they skipped for nearly 30 years afterward. Perhaps that's exactly why so many people remain invested in this couple. It isn't because they've spent decades in the spotlight together. It's because, even now, audiences keep catching glimpses of something that feels completely genuine underneath all of it. So here's the real question worth sitting with. If you looked back at your own biggest day, what's the small, almost silly detail you'd still bring up 30 years later? Maybe that's the thing worth sharing in the comments, because sometimes those tiny regrets say more about a relationship than any grand gesture ever could.